The radical, fundamental principles of freedom, rational self-interest, and individual rights. This is the Yaron Brook Show.
All right, everybody, welcome. Welcome to Yaron Brook Show on this 4th of July weekend. Hopefully you're all having a great weekend and looking forward to celebrating tomorrow. And I think, as I said, I will be doing a show tomorrow on the 4th of July. So hopefully you will join me tomorrow. Not sure yet exactly what time, but we will be doing a show tomorrow. All right, today it's my great pleasure to have Amesh Adalja back on the show. Thanks, Amesh, for joining us. Those of you who don't know who Amesh is, he's a senior scholar at the Johns Hopkins Center for Health Security. He is an infectious disease specialist, a critical care physician, does emergency medicine, and I'm not going to read the whole bio, but is one of the most cited epidemiologists right now in the media. We were just talking about the quantity of media that Amesh has done over the last year and a half is astounding, and it doesn't seem to be letting up. So thanks for joining us, Amesh.
Sure, thanks for having me.
Sure. So let's start with just kind of maybe if you give us an update on where we are in the United States in terms of COVID and what your projections are on kind of the direction we're heading.
In the United States, I think we're in a fairly good place. And that's due to the fact that we've basically decoupled the virus from its ability to cause serious disease, hospitalization, and deaths at the rate that it could. And that's because vaccine went initially to those high-risk individuals, people that were in nursing homes, elderly individuals who constituted the majority of people who got hospitalized. And that's really what the whole public health enterprise against COVID had been in the United States, was not about eradicating or eliminating it. That's not possible. What it was about was making sure our hospital systems didn't get crushed again. And that's what we've done. And I think if you walk through a hospital now, and I just came from the hospital here in Pittsburgh in July, I saw 0 COVID patients. In January, I was seeing 40, 50 COVID patients in a day. In one weekend, rounding. It's much, much different. And what's different about it is all our high-risk people have been vaccinated. So that's where we are. There still is, however, significant disruption from COVID because we have pockets of the country where there are not enough people vaccinated. So we're seeing more contagious variants being able to take hold. So we're hearing about hospitals that are in tough times in Springfield, Missouri, for example, but it's not a systemic risk the way it was back in the spring of 2020 or the winter of 2020, 2021, because of the vaccine. So I think that we're headed towards, ending the acute phase of the pandemic and the public health emergency. It's a very different picture if you leave the United States and look at the world globally. But I think we are on a good trajectory, and I think that's due to the vaccine.
And tell us a little bit about this Delta variant that everybody's talking about. I mean, it sounds like it's more infectious. Is it also more deadly? Does it increase the probability of going to hospital?
So the Delta variant is what was once called the India variant, and there was issues with the stigmatization of certain countries by calling them certain names. So the WHO came up with this better nomenclature, and then there was the other hard names, which were numbers. So the Delta variant was 617, or you had all these different numbers that were hard to remember for people. So they basically started to come up with this Greek lettering. So the Delta variant is what was called the India variant, and it is something that came to the world's attention after India experienced a horrendous surge, which led to a lot of deaths and hospitals running out of oxygen. And what we found out about this Delta variant is that it has a cluster of mutations that make it more transmissible from person to person. So this appears to be the most contagious version of the virus that we've seen, more contagious than the natural version and more contagious than the Alpha variant, which became the dominant variant. That was the UK variant, it used to be called. So this is something that's made it very difficult to control in an unvaccinated population. Whether or not it's more deadly, that's something that's not completely clear yet. There have been some anecdotal reports, and they're only anecdotal, from the UK, from China, showing higher rates of severe disease, but that takes some time to tease out, and it's unclear whether or not it is more contagious. Whether it is more deadly, it's definitely more contagious. That's what we can say. But the good thing about the Delta variant is that our vaccines, especially the big 4 vaccines, Pfizer, AstraZeneca, Moderna, and J&J do handle it. So this is something that's completely controllable by getting vaccine into people's arms.
So you mentioned China there. I mean, we haven't heard a lot about resurgence of COVID in China, but is it still an issue in China? Or are we still getting reports about COVID in China?
There are still some cases occurring in China, and the Delta variant is there. Obviously, China has a lot of issues with how it reports cases. It doesn't often report asymptomatic cases where we report all of them. So when you see numbers there, they're usually a gross underestimate. But yes, COVID is going to be an endemic virus in all countries of the world. It's not going to go anywhere. And countries like Australia and New Zealand are going to see how wrong their approach was, because it's not sustainable, this elimination or COVID zero approach, because this is a respiratory virus that spreads efficiently. There was no chance of it being contained. The goal was to keep it from causing harms to our hospital systems. And I think that's what's going to be the trajectory. We're going to have COVID cases 5 years from now.
Mm-hmm. Taiwan initially did a phenomenal job of containing the virus, and recently they've had a surge. Was that significant? Was that because they let their guard down? Or is this again this phenomenon of you can't go to zero?
Well, Taiwan was it's the best nation. If you look at how COVID was handled, they were able to keep it to eight or so deaths with no lockdowns, no shutdowns, because they were able to test, trace, and isolate. And they jumped into action on December 31st, 2019, just with rumors. But what's happened is they've had a hard time vaccinating their population. And one of the reasons why is because China has been blocking their access to buy vaccines on the market. So China has been interfering with Taiwan's ability to get vaccines, and that's made it hard for them to vaccinate. And they need to vaccinate because as interaction increases, you're going to see cases, and that's what their surge is about. Not enough people have been vaccinated. It's interesting, China also, with their what they call their vaccine diplomacy, where they give vaccines to these countries. Some countries, in order to get those vaccines, have to de-recognize Taiwan, because that's the condition that China places on the donation of the vaccine. So I think Taiwan still is at the top of my list as the best country, and I think it's really, really unfortunate that the Chinese government continues to try and victimize the Taiwanese. And I think that people need to be more aware of that and call it out for what it is, this bullying behavior.
Yeah, that's disgusting. I didn't realize that they were having a hard time buying vaccines. I mean, it's a little pathetic that the United States is not standing up. I would ship the vaccines to Taiwan just to piss off the Chinese.
So we are. So President Biden they've stood with Taiwan. They sent people there. Taiwan is at the very top of the list of the U.S. shipments because of that reason.
Yeah, good. So any other, what are the hotspots right now in terms of globally? I mean, one of the things that I've noticed is Europe seems to have opened up. They're actually accepting American tourists. Even the recommendation now is to accept even non-vaccinated Americans. They just need the dollars, I think. But the UK is completely shut down. The UK is not accepting even vaccinated Americans. Any logic to that? Any?
No, there's no logic to that. And I think it's because even though many of these countries don't explicitly say they want to drive COVID to elimination, that ends up kind of infecting their thinking, no pun intended, infecting. But COVID, they have the Delta variant there. It's become dominant in England, and cases have gone up, which you would expect in the unvaccinated population. But their hospitalizations have not gone up that much because the high-risk population is vaccinated. So this is this issue that we've got to stop looking at cases now that there's a vaccine. We're in a very different place with COVID. We used to say that it was wrong to compare it to influenza, but now we're getting to that point where COVID in a highly vaccinated country like the UK, like the US, like Israel, like Canada, is becoming something that is more like other respiratory viruses. So that means we've got to change the risk perception and not so much look at cases, because they're not necessarily going to turn into hospitalizations and deaths like they always did before, because you've got the vaccine there. The vaccine is what I call a decoupler. It decouples those things. And many countries and many public policymakers and the general public have a hard time not being worried about cases now, because for so long, it always happened that you saw cases, and then a couple of weeks later, hospitalizations, and a couple of weeks later, death, and then you're in crisis. That's not the relationship in a highly vaccinated country now.
So, I mean, even the United States is in that situation right now, because we're not allowing people in. The Europeans have opened up their border, but Europeans are not allowed into the United States. Is there any timeline for when that, the border is going to be opened up?
Some countries are on a list that they can come in. Some countries are not. I think Europe is still on the bad list for the United States. I think we need to move away from that from the US, because we now have the ability to test. We can get people vaccinated. We have a lot of things that we didn't have before. So I've never been a fan of travel bans. I think travel screening is okay. And you can do that with rapid tests, and you tell people, take another test in 7 days, stay in your hotel. There's ways to do this without being so disruptive to people's lives. And I think we're going to get there in the United States. I think that we are likely to have more and more places open, especially as Americans are able to go to places. I know, for example, in New York, they're actually advertising for Canadians to come across the border and get vaccinated. So we are, and also the same thing is happening at the Mexican border as well. So I think you're going to see some softening of this in the next couple of weeks as we get into a better place in the United States and the policies start to shift.
I mean, at some point, there was a rumor that the Biden administration was going to open up the borders on July 4th. That the idea was that Independence Day was going to be the day where they declared the borders open to tourists and to visitors. It doesn't look like it's going to happen, but we'll see. We'll see.
It's going to be in different phases. So for example, India, they're probably going to be in the red for some time, but Canada, they're opening to, and I think some Asian countries and also some European countries and Israel, I think they'll make it easier for people to come. They're still going to, right now, the CDC guidance still requires you to get a test, even if you're fully vaccinated, if you come in, but there's not really a quarantine requirement. And I think this is going to slowly dissipate.
Yeah, and it's funny because I'm flying to Israel in about a month, I hope. And they won't recognize the little CDC card that says I'm vaccinated. So they won't let me out of isolation unless I get an an antibody test to show that I have antibodies. So they're not recognizing the United States. I think they're afraid of forgeries. I'm not sure exactly what's going on. But they're all vaccinated, so I'm not sure what they're scared of.
Yeah, I guess again, this is that mentality of COVID zero that kind of creeps into people's thinking. But because if you're fully vaccinated, you have nothing to fear from other people. The virus is no longer a threat to you, so other people are not a threat to you. It's just going to take some time for this. And I think this is something that the world should have thought about, that they should have come up with something better than these flimsy cards. The International Association of Travel Agents can make apps. There's ways to do this in a better way than we did, because we should have been thinking about how people were going to want to verify vaccination status and made it much easier than these little flimsy things that people carry around that can be easily forged.
No, it's stunning. It's stunning to me that this is what the United States has. The rest of the world seems to be much more sophisticated. So let's talk a little bit about the vaccines. I mean, there's it's been hundreds of millions of people now have received the vaccines in Europe and the United States, and Israel obviously is led the world in vaccination. What's the bottom line in terms of the safety record? And I know not all vaccines are the same, but overall, and then maybe we can dig into the various vaccines.
Overall, I'm very happy with the safety profile of all of these vaccines. And remember that when you look at a vaccine safety profile, you always have to balance it against the risk of the disease or what it's preventing. It's always a risk-benefit calculation, which sometimes people forget about. But when you look at, for example, the Moderna and Pfizer vaccines, extremely safe. And I'll talk about some of the side effects that occur in a minute. Same with the Johnson & Johnson vaccines, very safe in terms of the fact that when you do a risk-benefit calculation with the side effects that have been noted, they still favor the vaccines very heavily. So with the J&J vaccine, there was unfortunately this pause for 11 days that occurred because people were getting blood clots. This is a pause that I completely disagreed with. I said the government shouldn't have had this pause because it ended up increasing vaccine hesitancy, and we knew it was going to be hard to restart J&J vaccines once the pause was over. But this was about a rare type of blood disorder that occurred, similar to what happened with AstraZeneca, a very rare complication that occurred primarily in women of childbearing age, but still was outweighed by the benefit of the vaccine. But now there's a warning label for that out there. And this is something that's fairly rare. With the Moderna and Pfizer vaccines, we have noted in young adolescents, young adults, a condition called myocarditis, which is inflammation of the heart. And everybody gets worried when you talk about inflammation of a heart in a young person. But what we found is that this is a rare occurrence. It seems to happen more likely after the second dose of the vaccine, and tends to be very mild compared to other cases of myocarditis, very transient. All those people usually get hospitalized because nobody messes around when somebody's heart is inflamed, but these people go on to recover fairly well. So this is, again, another risk-benefit calculation. And this one I'm a little bit more nuanced on. So I say if you're 18 years older and a male, maybe you should get the J&J vaccine because it doesn't have that risk. You don't have to worry about it, and you don't have to worry about the blood clot risk so much in males with the J&J vaccine. For younger kids, the first dose, it seems to be fine. There is some hypothesis about maybe delaying that second dose 12 weeks versus giving it at at 3 or 4 weeks, and maybe you blunt this response. And there's also good data that one dose in children, if you look at the clinical trials, has very high immunogenicity, maybe enough to carry a child forward without having any major risk. And again, also when you're vaccinating children, it's I think a lot of parental preference if you want to do this or not, because children are spared from the severe disease and children are not spreaders of this infection. But one of the things I say in the United States is that we've had so many children have their life put on hold that giving them the vaccine is one way for them to reclaim their childhood. So I tend to encourage for that reason only, because we've kept children out of school, we've kept children out of summer camp, we've kept children out of doing anything because of COVID risks, and the vaccine is one way for them to get back to normal. So I don't think it's bad I don't think it's a bad idea to vaccinate children because of the way that the risk perception in the United States. But certainly the WHO has said not to vaccinate children because it's not going to make a major impact on the morbidity and mortality of the pandemic, because they're not the ones that are getting hospitalized or becoming deathly ill. So this is a kind of a controversy in the field right now over the role of children in the vaccine.
So what is your view if somebody's young? I mean, the risk of COVID is low if you're young, and there's some side effects and maybe inflammation of the heart from the vaccine. What's the trade-off, and where do you think people should come out in that trade-off?
So a lot of it's going to depend upon your personal risk preference and risk tolerance. I think COVID is something that nobody should want to have. There is a chance that you could have a severe case, even if you don't have any other pre-existing problems. There's a chance you could get long COVID, which is still a bit of a mystery, but it occurs in some small percentage of people. And it's also going to be disruptive to your life because you're not going to feel good. You're not going to be able to go to work. There's going to have to be contact tracing, all of that, especially if you were in contact with somebody who might have been not vaccinated and at high risk. So that's something that I think you should try to avoid. The vaccine for most people, I think, is going to be the answer to that. And I think that the vaccine also is a way to get back your life in terms of what you can do without the worry of COVID. So in general, I come out on favor of everybody wanting the vaccine or getting the vaccine, that this is a personal value to them. Again, if people are worried about the myocarditis risks, we luckily have 3 different vaccines on the market here in the United States, so that you can kind of navigate that and maybe get the J&J vaccine if you're an 18-year-old boy and you don't want and you want the vaccine because you want to play sports, or your employer might require it. That's one way to go about it. The other ones, I think we have to kind of think about in general what the vaccine is, the goal is to get more of the adults vaccinated. That's what President Biden's goal was. That's where we've been trying to focus on. So I think it's a little bit different with children, but again, it's a lot of risk tolerance that you have to think about and risk preferences. And remember, this is only a temporary thing. Once we get people's risk perceptions change, as everybody sees that COVID's not going to crush our hospitals again, I think that this is going to become more of a routine thing when people get vaccinated, and we're not going to be tracking the numbers maniacally like I do every day. Look to see what percentage of the U.S. population is vaccinated.
So Jeff here writes, he says, I finally decided to get a shot because of Yaron and your info, Amesh. Amesh. I chose to get the J&J when available. Then Canada shut it down. Now I am making an irrational stand for the producer we demanded. So I only want this one shot. So unfortunately, Canada looks like has made J&J unavailable.
Yeah, so what happened was the J&J vaccine, which has had a slurry of bad press. There's a plant in Baltimore that makes the J&J vaccine, and they had major sterility and issues and contamination problems. And full disclosure, I was a consultant to that company on unrelated matters, but it's called Emergent. That was the contractor for J&J.
Yep.
And so what happened was the FDA initially said, we don't know if these are safe or are going to be effective. So Canada basically just didn't allow those J&J shots to be used. The FDA has cleared batches of the J&J vaccine. I believe those Canadian batches are cleared, so they could give them. And the other thing about J&J is we've got expiring doses in the United States that they can't give to anybody. Those were made in the Netherlands, not at the Baltimore plant. I've advocated, I wrote an op-ed in the Hill saying, just drive that to Canada and give it to Canadians and give it to Mexicans at the border, just because that's an easy shot to give, and it was expiring. The FDA did extend the shelf life, so they're still there. But you could walk across the border to Buffalo, and get your shot if you're near Canada, near the New York border, and just get it. And now Canada, they allow fully vaccinated Canadians to go back home without the 14-day quarantine, which was long overdue. But I would say come to the United States and get the J&J vaccine.
So let's see if there's anything else here on vaccines. So some research suggests very rare side effects due to injection procedure. Had to ask back channels for assurance that Canada Healthcare uses aspiration technique. I don't know what that is. Kudos to Dr. John Campbell. Why a lack of transparency? I'm not sure. Do you know what that's referring to?
No, I don't know any issues with the injection procedure. This is a standard needle type of thing that we get into people's arms, and not a major issue that I've seen anywhere with regard to needles. There was actually this weird snafu with getting needles that could get all the material out, because originally we had to throw doses out because the U.S. government didn't send the right needles with the kits, so they lost doses. But no, I don't know anything about any issue with this injection that the questioner is asking about.
Any other issues? Any new vaccines coming out? I know there's one U1 that I just read about that's supposed to be very promising. Any new vaccines? And then I'm curious what you think the protocol is going to be moving forward in terms of vaccines. So
Operation Warp Speed still has a couple candidate vaccines that they've invested in. So Novavax is one, which is an American company.
That's the one I read about.
Yeah, that has a recombinant. It's a recombinant type of. It's also uses a new cool vaccine platform technology. This looks very good in clinical data. The FDA is probably not going to approve anything on emergency use anymore. They're going to wait for full FDA approval, but Novavax will be something I expect will get approved. There are other second generation vaccines using different technologies, like some being grown in tobacco plants, some doing using different mRNA types of technologies, DNA technologies. Those are all kind of in the back of the pack, and they may end up becoming second generation vaccines when we make this more of a routine childhood vaccination. I think that's what the trajectory is going to be, is that after we get through this acute phase, this is going to likely be something that children get, and that might take care of them for the rest of their life or for some period of time against not only this coronavirus, but other coronaviruses as well. And there are efforts underway to make universal coronavirus vaccines, because remember, this is the 7th human coronavirus we've discovered, and 4 of them cause 25% of our common colds, and knocking those out with the vaccine would also be very beneficial as well. So I think this is what will happen, is that we'll get through this acute phase, and then it's going to become a childhood vaccination. The booster shot debate, which the press is really interested in, to me, I think it's very premature to think we're going to need boosters for the average person, because what would really trigger the need for a booster to me is having fully vaccinated people get breakthrough infections that land them in the hospital, and that's exceedingly rare, and we're not there yet, and we don't have that happening. Maybe for immunosuppressed populations, people who've got an organ transplant or a bone marrow transplant, they may need boosters more frequently, but in general, I don't think it's going to be something in the short term in the United States.
Good. So what is your view, or what does the research show about some of these vaccines that were produced overseas? Primarily, so Alejandrina, who does my super chat here, she's actually in Venezuela, and they have 3 vaccines available: the Russian, the Chinese, and the Cuban. Any views on those, and but if how efficacious they are, and then how safe they are?
So let's start with the Russian vaccine. A lot of us kind of dismissed it, but they actually published their data in Lancet, a major medical journal, and it looked good in phase 3 clinical data. There's been some concerns about the quality control and how well they're making it, and they use something very similar to the J&J and the AstraZeneca approach, but whether or not they've completely done it perfectly, there's some questions whether some batches were bad, and I know Brazil had a big fight with them over it. But I think the Russian vaccine, if you can take the phase 3 clinical data and if they have the quality control, does look like a viable vaccine. It hasn't received WHO emergency approval or the emergency stamp, but it is something that's out there. The Chinese vaccines both have received approval by the WHO, but they seem to clearly be inferior when it comes to breakthrough infections. And we're seeing that in the Seychelles Islands, which basically vaccinated a great proportion of the population, but now they're in trouble again. And many of those people did get the Chinese vaccines. And even the director of the Chinese CDC has said our vaccines are inferior compared to the mRNA and other vaccines. So I'm not so sure about them. They're definitely better than nothing. They definitely protect you against serious disease, hospitalization, and death. We're seeing that. But against mild infections, they're probably not as good. The Cuban vaccine, we've heard a little bit about. It looks like it looks to be good. I haven't seen the data yet on it. I haven't heard anything bad about it, but I know that it does have some, at least early clinical data that seems to show that it is robust. And the Cubans tend to have a pretty good vaccine development effort for whatever reason, however that it continued to exist in Cuba. That's the case. And one more point about the Chinese vaccines: they have not published any of that data in a phase 3 clinical trial in any medical journal, which again is a lack of transparency of a vaccine that they're giving to the entire world. And everybody wants to see this data, but we have not seen it.
So if somebody has a choice between the Russian and the Chinese, you would definitely go with the Russian vaccine.
I think so. Although that one of the things that's happening is that countries are being said to accept vaccines that are all WHO approved for travel. So because the Russian vaccine isn't on the WHO list, they may say it's not approved, so it doesn't count. So there's that issue that you have to worry about. And I don't know if the Russians plan to get approval or not.
I assume they'd want to try, but then
it would be a big win for them because they've they made this a big. I mean, they called it Sputnik for a reason. They really want to show off this vaccine. So hopefully they do get that approval, because I know a lot of the world has been vaccinated by it, and it's going to be very disruptive if that vaccine, one of the vaccines, doesn't count, especially one that they've actually published in a medical journal about.
And in terms of, one of the things that when Biden was talking about doing away with the intellectual property rights, the IP for the vaccines, and trying to put it in the public domain in a sense, one of the issues is that these vaccines are really hard to produce. And so even if you did that, it's unlikely that you'd get more vaccine actually produced. Is that true? I mean, are these vaccines, particularly I think the mRNA vaccines, are difficult?
In the sense that you need to have special equipment, you need to have special expertise, a lot of tacit knowledge in how you're going to make these vaccines. They're just not the same type of formula. And remember, Moderna has never enforced its patent throughout this pandemic, but the only group that makes the Moderna vaccine is Moderna. That's for a reason. These are difficult to do. And it's not something that, the suspension of patent waivers and all of that, the patent waiver issue was really a smokescreen. This wasn't going to increase access to vaccines for the developing world. India is a net vaccine exporter. India makes the AstraZeneca vaccine. They're a contract. So this was just basically smoke and mirrors for people who wanted to destroy pharmaceutical companies' intellectual property rights for a long time. This was a trial balloon, and it seemed to have succeeded for the first time. And I think this is a dangerous precedent, because no company is ever going to get engaged in making vaccines, getting involved in emerging infectious diseases, if at the end their property can just be confiscated from them. And this was something I spoke heavily about, probably the only one in my field that did this. And that got me a lot of hate mail, but I think it was worth it, because this is a point that can't be underscored enough, that we would not have this bright future in the U.S. if it wasn't for Moderna, BioNTech, Pfizer, AstraZeneca, Johnson & Johnson. And I think that this was a horrible move by the Biden administration and the trade representative, and hopefully it doesn't come to fruition. And I'm worried about the implications for the future.
I agree. And it looks like the Europeans were the ones who were standing up for property rights, and it was the Americans who were advocating for doing away with them. It's truly stunning. All right. Let's we have a sponsor for today's show. John is sponsoring the show, and he sent me a bunch of questions that are related to ivermectin, but really not just ivermectin, broadly to the treatment of COVID and to some of the controversies around treatment and around taking people like what's his name? Brett Weinstein off of YouTube and things like that. So I've got a bunch of questions. I'm going to read them as if they're super chat. And I sent them in advance to Amos. So I'm not springing anything out of nowhere on him. But if you could tell us a little bit about, from the perspective of both a clinician and kind of a theory guy, right? Both sides, and looking at the research and everything. What is your assessment generally of ivermectin as a cure for COVID?
So just to take a step back, so ivermectin is an anti-parasitic drug. It's been around since the 1970s. People won a Nobel Prize for it because it's so important for certain diseases like river blindness. This is a drug that's been around for a while. It's a fairly safe drug. And what it has shown with many viruses is that it has in vitro activity against certain viruses, meaning it stops viruses from replicating. So people early on thought, could this be a treatment for COVID-19? And there have been multiple clinical trials that have gone on. And, it comes down to the point where I don't think, in my opinion, looking at the data and as someone who treats patients, that there's enough evidence that I would prescribe this to a person outside of a clinical trial. This is, I would say, it's not hydroxychloroquine. Hydroxychloroquine, there was clearly there was a lot more negative data about hydroxychloroquine than ivermectin. There are some trials that show a positive benefit, but the problem with those trials is that they have high risks of bias in them. They're not well controlled. And when you do see the randomized controlled trials, there was one that was published in JAMA a couple of months ago, they did not show a benefit. So if you look at the guidelines from the Infectious Disease Society of America, which I'm a fellow of, they recommend against the use of it, although that gets updated as time goes on. The NIH guidelines say they don't give a recommendation one way or the other. They say they cannot recommend for or against it, but they want more study. So I think ivermectin is something that we need to know more about. And the British are going to be doing a major trial now called the Principal trial that will probably give us a definitive answer. There's been some meta-analysis where they combine all the studies, and the meta-analyses are only as good as the
underlying studies.
Right.
Yeah.
And a lot of them have very high risks of bias in them. So I don't think we can say for sure that this is something that's beneficial. I personally would not prescribe it. I know there are some physicians that do. I think that this has become a controversy for no reason. We're just still trying to get a better idea of the data before you can make an official recommendation. This should be standard of care. And I don't think we're there yet. And the good trials, the better trials haven't shown a benefit. So it may be something that doesn't end up actually showing a benefit when you study it rigorously. And there is a lot of anecdotal evidence out there and a lot of people advocating for it, which has made it much harder to actually cut through all of this, especially in South America, where they're just giving it out like water. And that's made it impossible to do clinical trials because nobody wants to be randomized to the placebo. So it's taken us much longer than necessary to come to a definitive conclusion on it. I would be surprised, though, that it makes a major benefit there. There may be a marginal benefit. That's where I would think it's going to land if it does. But again, it's not something I would give to my patients.
And when you see doctors giving it to their parents, I mean, do you consider that do you consider that malpractice, or do you consider that within the bounds of something reasonable, given that it doesn't have any negative side effects?
I don't consider it malpractice. I think it's something where there is probably some room when you're looking at the patient in front of you and you kind of make a shared decision with the patient about it. I don't think there's a lot of strong evidence that guides its use. There's biological plausibility, there's a hypothesis there, but there's not enough to say that this is going to be something that works. And I would be very careful about giving it to a patient, not because of side effects, but remember, they're giving this to outpatients, and they might say, they give it to a patient and the patient says, well, I'm just waiting for the ivermectin to kick in. So I'm going to wait it out another day before I go to the hospital. There's a danger in people delaying care. So I would be very careful. If you do give it to if you give ivermectin to a patient, I would check in on that patient pretty frequently just to make sure that they're not waiting for some effect that may not occur and that they delay care.
So this is I guess an epistemological question about, research in the field, right? To what extent do you think that double-blind kind of randomized, the standard kind of practice for testing new drugs should be the standard? Is this methodologically, epistemologically sound as the way to go in terms of evaluating drugs?
I think it's the best way to figure this out. It's not the only way. Anecdote's important. It starts that's how you generate a hypothesis. And there are other types of trials. You can do retrospective studies. There's lots of ways to do trials. But when you're looking for the most conclusive evidence, where you've controlled for everything but the drug, that's always going to come out on top. So the other evidence isn't thrown out. It's still weighted. And there's lots of drugs that we use that maybe didn't have great randomized controlled trial results, but just based on the preponderance of evidence from retrospective cohort studies, prospective trials, and unblinded trials, then you might continue to use it. And that gets all weighed in together. But obviously when you're trying that an RCT, or randomized control trial, jumps to the top of the list because of how they're designed specifically to isolate the effect of the drug. So this is something, I'm not a philosopher, but I know the Mills methods, where you try these methods of difference. If the only thing different between the group is that treatment, that's how you can come to the conclusion that treatment was responsible for the effect. So this comes back, I think, from Mills methods and the way that we conduct science in general. So I do think it is the gold standard, but that doesn't mean you throw out everything else. But I think they have to be weighted accordingly, that an RCT usually, if it's done correctly and done rigorously, will trump all of the other types of studies. But they all get combined together. And I think the preponderance of the evidence still makes it unclear whether there's a benefit for ivermectin.
So how much pressure is there on doctors, particularly when it comes to COVID? And particularly, I'd say, 6 months ago when things were really, really bad, and to prescribe a particular, a particular sequence of treatments rather than let the doctor make, evaluations themselves. How much has this been politicized within the profession, let's say?
Not at all. I've never had any pressure to do anything. I've sat there in the very beginning of the pandemic in March of 2020, scratching my head saying, do I give this patient hydroxychloroquine because we're hearing all of this? How do we think about this drug? No, so there's no pressure. Hospitals often have guidance that's out there, a protocol that you can use so that you don't have to spend so much time reinventing the wheel. But no, there's no pressure to do that as a clinician. As an infectious disease critical care doctor, I've had complete latitude of what I give to my patients without any pressure or pushback from anybody. I think that's kind of a false narrative. I've been able to give patients remdesivir, dexamethasone, tocilizumab. We have the ability to prescribe what we want without any kind of political interference. Obviously, if someone is doing something, there's always peer review. If you do something that completely is unjustified, you might end up getting asking to justify what you're using a lot of this drug. Why are you using it? Doesn't really seem to be fitting there. But no, there's never been any pressure. I work at a major academic medical center, and we had hydroxychloroquine protocols even before, when in the very early days when there was controversy about using it, that we had access to it. They were clear that they were doing clinical trials at our hospital, but if your patient doesn't fall into the clinical trial, feel free to use the drug. So there wasn't that kind of pressure. I think that's a little bit of a narrative that's not true and doesn't have any kind of ground truth to it, because most of the people saying that are not actually in the hospitals taking care of these COVID patients. They're probably not even doctors that are actually saying this, I would suspect.
Yeah, I mean, unfortunately, some of them are doctors, and it's hard to tell like this Dr. Corey from Houston has said that he's been fired or moved from department to department, or hospital to hospital because of pressure, because he was using ivermectin. I mean.
So Pierre Corey, I mean, he's a doctor. He's a legitimate, person in this field who works in critical care. I think that some of that, and some of this is speculation on my part, is because he got tied into the politics of this, and he testified for Senator Johnson, and he turned it into a bit of a crusade, which then I think hospitals don't like that. Hospitals, as someone who's in the media a lot and works for hospitals, they don't like that kind of attention, and that may be more a reflection of that rather than the protocol that he's using, and it may be more his style of advocacy than actually what he's actually doing when he's treating his patients. That might be the response to it. But again, ivermectin has become so fraught with controversy and so much acrimony especially on the advocates of ivermectin. I told you before that this is the thing that I get the most threats and the most hate mail over, and I don't even have, and I think I have a pretty fair opinion of it, but I'm on some list, so every day I get a list of, I get emails that basically threaten me because I say something about ivermectin in the press that they don't like. That's what's likely the reflection of this, rather than I think,
do you have a hypothesis as to why that is? I mean, again, this Dr. Corey, who, as you said, sounds like in many ways, legit in the field. He says it's not political because he's not a Trump guy. He's not on the right necessarily. He might even be kind of a leftist. It's hard to tell. But what is driving this? Because there's a kind of sense of conspiracy. There's this almost violence associated with the way people think about these topics.
It's really baffling to me. We haven't seen this with any other infectious disease that I can ever remember. I mean, I think there probably was some of that in the early days of HIV, where people were protesting protesting at Dr. Fauci's house, even Dr. Fauci back then during the HIV crisis back in the 1980s. So this is something that's very different, I think, in the modern era. And it may be that because so much of the pandemic has been seen through the lens of whatever tribe you belong to, if you're a Democrat or if you're a Republican, that somehow, because ivermectin got associated with Senator Johnson, who was on the right, that this became a Republican issue versus a Democrat issue, and that might have put as soon as that happens, everybody's kind of warning lights go on. This is the same thing that happened when Donald Trump happened to be for something, whether or not it was good or bad, it ended up becoming very hard. So I was somebody who wanted the schools open. And the worst thing that happened for opening schools was Trump agreeing with us, because it made it so much harder to actually get through to people. Because before that, the American Academy of Pediatrics, a lot of us had been talking and advocating for schools to be open. Then Trump said, I agree with that. And then the whole thing just went up in smoke. So sometimes that's what's happening, that everybody is so much in a tribal mindset that everything gets viewed through that light. And what do tribes do? They fight with each other violently, and that's what's happened. And it's kind of sad, because all of us doctors in the middle get pigeonholed no matter what. I mean, that's one of the reasons I go on all three major cable networks all the time, so that I can't be pigeonholed that I'm on Fox, CNN, and MSNBC equally.
Yep. Do you get any sense that there are doctors out there that are not talking about the strategies they have to deal with COVID out of fear of either losing their license or fear of just this kind of these attacks?
No, I don't think that's the case. I don't think that anybody's taking complaints to the state medical board. And indeed, I know that there are doctors, and I'm talking to you from Pittsburgh, in the Pittsburgh area, that are giving ivermectin, and none of us, and it would be people like, they would ask us, people in the infectious disease field, to actually file those complaints or to get involved in those issues. I've never been asked that. I don't think that that's actually happening to any degree, to my knowledge. I don't know that it's not happening in any state, but I don't think that that's actually the case. And most of ivermectin use is actually happening in the outpatient world, not in the inpatient world, which is much freer. You know, with the primary care doctor deciding to give his patient ivermectin, that's probably not something that people are paying much attention to, other than their peers or the insurance company or something like that. So I don't think that that's the case. You know, I've actually tried to persuade people, why are you using so much ivermectin? I tell them that I don't think that there's this, what's the data there? I don't think that there's, you know, people are hiding it. We know who's prescribing ivermectin. And this happens a lot with infectious disease. We know people do crazy things for Lyme disease a lot. There's a whole cottage industry of people giving stuff, putting people in hyperbaric chambers for Lyme disease, and nobody loses a license over that. So I don't think that's the case. I think this is not really reflective of what's happening. And again, the issue is we want to know, does ivermectin work or not? We don't have the clinical trial data yet to say that. So some doctors, according to even the NIH guidelines, say that they don't recommend for or against it. I don't use it. I don't think it is, but so I don't think that fits the narrative here.
So there's this other narrative out there that basically is the problem with ivermectin. The reason none of the authorities want to give it a thumbs up is because it's, you know, nobody's making money off of it. It's really cheap. I think Merck produces ivermectin, but it's you know, dollars. It's nothing. And versus something like remdesivir, which you know, there haven't been that many studies, but it's very expensive, so it's approved quickly. How do you deal with arguments like that? And I see it all the time. You know, we're forced to take vaccines because the drug companies are making a lot of money off of vaccines, and they are, you know, it's one big conspiracy in the background.
So the first thing, ivermectin and remdesivir don't compete with each other. Remdesivir is an inpatient drug, and nobody thinks remdesivir is a knockout punch. Remdesivir gets you out of the hospital faster. It's if you're in the hospital with COVID and you need oxygen, the drug I give you is another very, very cheap drug called dexamethasone that nobody's making money on, and we use it. We push it. This is one of our greatest success stories in COVID-19, is the story of dexamethasone, which cheap steroid, everybody's had a steroid. So I don't know how that fits. Remdesivir is not the main workhorse in the hospital. It's dexamethasone, a cheap generic steroid that can be given by mouth. So that's not the case. So I don't think that it's anything to do with it, because nobody's giving remdesivir as an outpatient. There are monoclonal antibodies and things that people are doing in the outpatient setting, but that's not the issue. I mean, we would love to have a cheap drug, especially as we're going to be fighting COVID in the developing world well into 2022. So if there was a cheap drug that could work, it would be great. I mean, that's what a lot of us said with hydroxychloroquine. We hope it works, because it would be such an easy fix if that worked, and it didn't. That's the whole thing. I hope ivermectin works, but I don't know that it does. And if it did, it would be great, but we need more data. And I think until then, I think it's something that we have to think about studying in more detail. And I think that this is kind of silly. And Merck, the manufacturer, said, Merck, the manufacturer, said, don't use ivermectin for COVID-19. We don't have the data. So this is, and Merck would stand to get money, even if it isn't very profitable of a drug for them. They're the ones telling people, don't prescribe it for this because it doesn't make sense. Yep. So I think that there's a lot there that needs to be, you know, the light shed on, because there's a lot of mythology about ivermectin. I think that doesn't really fit.
Well, it's more than that. I think there's a certain hostility to drug companies, a certain assumption that the authorities, including the medical associations, are driven by controlled by the drug companies, and the drug companies, are focused on profits, and therefore they're suppressing information about cheap solutions, which is, so there's these meta conspiracy theories that this is just falling into. People view it as confirmation. It's sad. Let's see. I wanted to ask you, what about the antibody treatment that, there was a while, Trump got it when he was in, we had a friend who went to hospital and he got it, who was older. What happened to that? Is it still efficacious? Is it still being treated? And does anybody now get it when they go into hospital?
So think about, the monoclonal, these are monoclonal antibodies I talked about, which were basically synthetic antibodies that we were targeting to people who were at high risk for hospitalization, who didn't yet require hospitalization. The problem with them was that they're so hard to give because you've got to find a patient that's high risk, but not sick enough to need hospitalized, and get to them quick enough where you can give them this. And initially these were 1 hour infusions. So you've got to find a place to give them the infusion, and emergency departments were crowded at that time. They didn't want people there sitting there for an hour. You can't send them to the cancer infusion center because those people have COVID. So there was really a poor concept of operations for how to use them, but they have eventually started to be used more. So there are 3 products out there now. There was a Lilly product, Regeneron, and another one from GSK. What's happened is that lots of big hospitals have now come up with, now that they have breathing room, literally breathing room, so they can actually set up protocols to identify these people. So that's happening now. One of the things that's happened though is the Lilly product has been removed from the market because the variants, not the Delta variant, but the Brazilian variant, the P1 variant, which I forget its number. It's other one. It's a Greek letter, and then the Beta variant, which is the South African one. Their prevalence is too high, and the Eli Lilly product doesn't seem to work against them. So the Lilly monoclonal antibody, first they added another monoclonal antibody, now they pulled it completely from the market. That one's gone, but you can still get the Regeneron and this new GSK version out there. And some people are actually starting to use, there's a clinical trial going on now to see if you can use this in the hospital. There are some people who get infected and they don't make their own antibodies, and they have a higher risk for severe complications. So you can test someone that's in the hospital. Have they made antibodies yet? No, give them this. So this is something that's also in the works. So this is out there, but just hasn't been, they've been underutilized a lot.
So how does a doctor who's in the front line of these things, and, particularly in a time of crisis, and there's a lot of information coming and going, how do you get, the best information? Where did kind of the current standard of care, the best that's possible, and is that best as possible available to every physician out there on the front lines, or are there sometimes shortages and you can't have access to the best?
So early on, there definitely were shortages of remdesivir, but again, that wasn't a knockout punch, and that got figured out pretty quickly. The way you get the best access to the information are the professional societies. So every specialty in medicine has its own society. So there's the Infectious Disease Society of America, just like there's the American College of Cardiology or the American Stroke Association. Those types of individuals, and some of my friends are on those committees. They have their members, doctors like me, that sit on those committees, and their whole time they just sift through all the data and continue to make a living document that updates, which is available to anybody that wants them on the web. And that's the best way you get that information. At the same time, doctors have to remember this. You became a doctor. You didn't become a doctor to quit learning. You got to continue to read medical journals. And I say medical journals on purpose, not just reading web stuff and summaries in regular news. You've got to pick up journals and look and see what's going on in the clinical trial data, what's happening real time. You need to do that. So that's the standard that you do, but that's what the professional societies try to summarize for you. They're always putting out bulletins, and hospitals do that as well. Hospitals have infectious disease departments that are constantly trying to refine protocols to make it easier for the frontline doctors to be able to do all of this type of work, and making infectious disease and critical care experts accessible to everybody to give lectures. I can't count how many lectures I've given just to doctors groups on how do you do this, or how should I approach this patient, not just for COVID, but for anything from HIV to severe flu to septic shock. I do that all the time. I mean, this happens it happens a lot. It's just a normal functioning of medicine. It's just that this is so acute. People haven't lived through a pandemic they haven't really delved into the guideline process or been so interested in treatments the way they are with COVID-19. But that's basically how it happens.
And how confident are you in these committees of doctors? Are these the best physicians out there? How much has politics impacted them, do you think?
I don't think politics has impacted them at all. So I know somebody I trained with at Pittsburgh is the head of the IDSA committee on COVID-19, somebody I've known since I was a training fellow. I have complete confidence in the guidelines from the Infectious Disease Society of America. I've sat on guideline committees for the Senate at the CDC, for botulism, for plague, for anthrax. I don't think there's politics at all. It's a very dry academic discussion. So I don't think that politics played any role in any of those guidance. What plays a role is there, the question is, is there enough evidence to make a statement? Because you know that when you do, when you say we recommend this, that's going to change how everybody's going to look at that. All these doctors in all these small towns are going to start doing that. You want to be sure that you do that because your word is going to be really, really important. So you want to make sure you get it right, that you don't cause harm. And that's what the guideline committees do. They are very cautious because they know that everybody is going to then follow what they do. So they want to make sure they have the best evidence, the most up-to-date evidence, and that they appropriately weigh the risks and benefits of whatever they're going to recommend, because that becomes gold. And it also becomes a medical legal thing too. Once a guideline is out there, all those malpractice lawyers are going to say, well, you didn't follow the guidelines, and they're going to sue people. So there's a lot of effort to get this right.
Do you get a sense that because of that, there's maybe, these committees, and not just with COVID, but generally, there's maybe too much risk aversion?
I wouldn't say it's risk aversion. I think it's about making sure that they have enough data. It may take them time to get enough data to be able to move the needle on their recommendation. So if you look at ivermectin, since we're talking about that, the NIH initially recommended against it. Then more data came in, and the needle moved to, we do not recommend for or against it. So they kind of do that kind of wiggly types of statements, and then they'll say, we recommend yes, but with this level of evidence, with this level of confidence. That's how they will come out to it. So I think it's more about getting it right, and a lot of emphasis on evidence-based medicine, and a lot of evidence on RCTs that are done really well, that are going to drive change. But remember, how quickly did the guidance change on dexamethasone? Almost overnight. As soon as the recovery trial data was published, everybody started using it. And so there's another monoclonal antibody we give to people that are in that cytokine storm called tocilizumab. Its brand name is Actemra. There was data that the guideline committees they lagged, but the clinical trials started appearing in the New England Journal and others, and then doctors started changing, and then the guidelines changed. So it's not always that it's, there's always a little bit of dyssynchrony, but I don't think that it's not as if that, I guess just because ivermectin or something is not there doesn't mean that that's the reason why people aren't using it. When there is incontrovertible evidence in front of doctors from RCTs, like there was with dexamethasone, like there was with tocilizumab, they moved before the guidelines did. It just became standard of care quickly, and then the guidance changed.
So if somebody gets COVID, how confident do you think they can be that they're going to get kind of the best treatment? If they either go to the primary care physician, or if they're going, if they have a severe case and they're going to the hospital?
It all depends on where you are and the competence and how up to date your doctor is. I mean, this is not just the case with COVID-19. This is people call me all the time. I just got diagnosed with such and such. I want to know who the best doctor is. Are they doing it right? I'm always looking over other doctors' work. So that's not something new to COVID. I think in general, there's so much information out there about COVID, and so many hospitals had to deal with COVID, even small hospitals, that they developed expertise in dealing with it. Unfortunately, we had 600,000 people die in this country. So every small corner hospital all around the country has had experience with COVID. So I think you do get the best treatment. There may be some places where certain drug, like when you're very ill, when you're in the hospital in the ICU, where you probably will get better. I would say you'd get much better care at academic medical centers, because you've got round-the-clock care from research-type doctors that are up to date on everything, versus being at a community hospital. But that's true whether or not you had COVID or whether you had influenza. Being at, for example, the University of Pittsburgh Medical Center is going to be very different than if you're at a small-town hospital, because of the level of acuity they're used to. But in general, for the treatments, I think that's going to be pretty uniform around there. It's really the caliber of the doctors and the comfort with the high level of acuity that some of these COVID patients have. That's where the differences are.
So if we take a step back and we look at the last year and a half and everything that's happened around COVID and kind of the response in the US, in Europe, in Asia, Taiwan, what do you think what conclusion would you come to in terms of particularly the US's response relative to the rest of the world, and relative to kind of a gold standard response?
I think the US failed completely. This was a massive government failure from the federal level to the state level to the local level. And it's the most disgusting aspect of it, because I was somebody that worked on pandemics since I was in training and had been part of big panels, wrote reports, give lectures, brief congressional staff, sat inside, in the White House briefing people on these things, and they never actually took us seriously. They basically thought they could wing this. And I think one of the lessons I got is that no matter how great your plans are, no matter how great your subject matter experts are, if you don't have the political leadership that's actually going to do the right thing, it doesn't matter. And that's what happened. Is we had evasion in January, February, half of March, where all the decisive action could have been taken, and we could have been much more like Taiwan than we were. But we didn't do any of that. We first ignored it. Then when they started to make a test, they botched the whole process I still don't understand how that happened. And I know some of the people involved. I don't know how what happened there. And then we had all of these undetected chains of transmission that boiled over into New York and put New York into crisis. And then we had governors use very blanket types of rules that didn't really reflect the risk, and it was just more reflective of their fear. And then they opened things back up in the summer, and then the same thing happened again. And they still didn't fix the problems that we told them were there. Let higher contact tracers, get better testing. None of them wanted to do that. They would rather shut things back down. And then, so they said, okay, they can't do that. There's no way that can happen again. And then it happened again in winter. So to me, I don't understand what's going on. I think it has to do with politicians having these very short time horizons and being rewarded with the wrong incentives. If a politician only thinks about a 2-year or 5-year election or 4-year election cycle, they're not going to actually do this properly. And I think that's what's happened. The US, the only shining part of this has been the vaccine distribution effort, that we got vaccine into high-risk peoples. That was the only way the US was going to get out of this. Otherwise, if we didn't have the vaccine, we would be in a horrible situation, because we've failed at everything. We still don't have enough contact tracers.
And that's true of every Western country. I mean, I don't know of any country that has not failed. I mean, look at Australia. They just shut down Sydney.
Yeah, Australia and New Zealand particularly went this other route where they thought that they could, I guess maybe as island nations, that they could keep it out. So now they're unable to live sustainably with it. They have the percentage of their population that's fully vaccinated is in the single digits in both of those countries. So they basically shut things down at the drop of a hat, and this is not sustainable. They're not going to be able to engage with the world unless they come up with a way to actually be able to cope with COVID-19 and recognize the fact that it's going to be an endemic respiratory disease that they're going to have to deal with year in and year out. And I go on Alaskan and New Zealand, Australian and New Zealand press, and I tell them that, and they're usually shocked when I actually criticize them, because they think that they're the envy of the world. I think they're the actual opposite. The US failed for a totally different reason. Australia and New Zealand, even though their deaths are lower, they may think that's successful, but what they put themselves in is an untenable position. And I think that's a failed response as well. Taiwan is where we should be looking. China should be letting them get their vaccines.
Absolutely. So does this give you any confidence that next time will be better, and next time could be much deadlier?
Remember, this is something that has a case fatality ratio probably of 0.6 or something like that, which I told you a long time ago that's what it was going to.
I mean, I think you predicted 800,000 deaths on my show, and everybody thought you were nuts. And we're at 600,000. We got very close to your number. So you were spot on from the beginning.
So I think that this is scary, because think about some of those bird flu viruses that have a 60% case fatality ratio, or even something with 10% or even 3%. We would be in a major, major problem. What I think has to happen now is that every person has to speak up and say, this is unacceptable. You ruined our lives. You, the government, at the federal, state, and local level. And you have to take this seriously and actually invest in those core parts of government that are necessary, protecting people from getting infected, to have a system in place where you can actually move, and to fix the laws so that we don't have undefined states of emergencies, that we don't know what the metrics are. They don't know when they're going to end. We also have to make it much easier to get, for example, diagnostic tests out there when they should have just done what South Korea did. So the private sector and universities make test as much as you want. And like I said, we had a president saying, I don't want more testing. It makes us look bad. As if if you stopped doing mammograms, breast cancer would go away. That was President Trump's evasive approach to this. So I think we've got to fix this. And I think there is an opportunity. There are many bills in Congress. I've already been involved in many discussions on Capitol Hill regarding fixing these programs. And I think that we're likely to see that fixed in a sustainable way for the future, because what's happened is right now there's this window of opportunity because it's in the headlines and everybody's lives have been touched by this. But what happens is when this goes out of the headlines, people forget about it, and then and the same thing happens again 5 years from now or something like that. So I think we have the opportunity to get it right. But no, I'm not confident that we could do better. And I'm very scared, a lot more scared than I was before about what would happen with a more severe pandemic. But I think everybody needs to say, this is something you have to fix because you basically screwed our lives up for over 18 months.
So are other doctors in the profession speaking up and engaged in trying to change and work on these bills in Congress?
Yeah, there are, but obviously there's people in the public health field as well as people in the infectious disease field. So I do think it's probably not the rank and file doctor that's a family medicine doctor in a small town, but definitely in the infectious disease world, this is where we focus on pandemics and emerging infectious disease. There's a lot of political activism going on right now, and a lot of interest in Congress because they now realize that this should be a priority. So hopefully this is sustainable and it works. And even at the White House level, they've reinstalled all those people, the national security staff that Trump had dismantled, that were focused on these types of pandemic threats. That whole office is back up and running at the White House. So I do think that there's hope that this could be better, and this is going to be better in the future.
All right, so we've got a bunch of super chat questions. I'm going to run through them. I know you're limited on time, but let's see. This is Ivermectin again. Ivermectin looks a bit promising, but I think he asked this before you answered, so I think you answered most of this. I did want to ask this and I didn't. What effect do you think YouTube taking like Brett Weinstein off when he talks about this and like the video right now that we're playing live on YouTube has a warning label underneath it that says, get the latest information from WHO about coronavirus. In a sense, don't trust these guys necessarily. I mean, to me, there's so much misinformation online about everything, but to me, this just raises it makes it more political. It seems like it makes it more political.
So the social media companies are very attuned to this risk. And I will tell you that my own posts on Facebook, which are completely orthodox, I guess you would say, because people say I'm part of the mainstream, that I'm a farmer shill, all that stuff. Yep. Those get flagged underneath my things. It says accurate information is available from the CDC, even if it's something that I've written with the, that I'm quoted alongside the CDC in an article agreeing that I think CDC Director Walensky is doing a good job. They'll still flag it. They're just flagging everything. I don't necessarily think that that's anything.
Well, Brett was taken off YouTube. I mean, the video was taken off because it was actively advocating for ivermectin. I don't know but I don't understand why and what they do exactly.
So I just know that. So I did a fact check on ivermectin, and that got taken down. And like it was a fact check actually saying so they don't know what they're doing most of the time.
Okay.
I think I definitely, because I had to say, well, why I sent it as a journalist. I'm like, I posted the article we did, and they took it down as fake news. And I'm like, but our article was about fake news, about calling this out as fake news. Yeah. So I really think that the algorithms are funny. I don't know what specifically happened with Brett Weinstein's video, but I know they're super hyper about this, that even positive things that would not be flagged are flagged because they're only putting things up from CDC or the World Health Organization. That may be what their algorithms are, and then you can have to kind of fight with them to get it back on or tell them. But I don't think that actually helps when they do that. I mean, I think you might want to put a label on it. You might want to say this is another perspective on it. But I think this just fuels some of the conspiracy theories. And I think I think it's important to have a debate about the science about these things. And I disagree with Brett Weinstein's position on ivermectin completely. But I think that people like that getting taken off of YouTube just going to fuel this worse and it's going to end up getting more threats to me for stupid reasons.
So Chad writes, I hear people using VAERS, I don't know what that is, data to claim Pfizer Moderna vaccines lead to strokes in rare cases. VAERS looks like it doesn't have a control group. Is there any credible evidence of stroke risk from mRNA vaccines?
So I've not seen any data on stroke risk. So VAERS is the Vaccine Adverse Event Reporting System.
Right. Yeah.
This is a CDC. This is a thing where you can just write anything that happens to you after you get a vaccine. Anything is in there. It's meant to be this catch-all where there's tons of noise and they sift through that and look for signal. And they sometimes do find signal. But you could get a vaccine and then you could get a lightning strike, and then that gets reported in VAERS. You get hit by a car, or you cut your finger on a knife. Anything can be reported. It's just anybody can report anything. So you should just look at VAERS data with a major grain of salt. And I think it's hard for the untrained person to realize this is just a catch-all that the CDC uses as a big bin to then say, is there anything real in there, when they sift through it and do a lot of data analysis. But the anti-vaccine movement will look through VAERS data and then put it up there. They'll put those numbers of deaths up there, and it has nothing to do with the vaccine, because just because something happens after you got the vaccine doesn't mean the vaccine caused it. And I think that's a big confusion about VAERS.
Correlation is not causation. All right. This is from Thomas. Dr. Fauci has been defied by many on the left and demonized by many on the right. You've previously spoken very highly of him. Is that still your view? Can you elaborate more on him and the divergent views of his role during COVID?
So I think the first thing to know about Dr. Fauci is he is an icon in the field. And even before COVID-19, he had made major discoveries in autoimmune diseases, HIV. He's one of the most published and most accomplished people in my field. So there is a great deal of respect for all that he's done for this field, and his expertise and his knowledge. I mean, he's 80 plus years old, and he's so sharp that he can blow most people off the stage in terms of medical knowledge. You have to remember that his role is the director of NIAID, which is part of NIH, and this is a public health response. So that's usually led by the CDC. So why didn't the CDC lead this? Because Trump basically did not allow them to do it. Mm-hmm. Nancy Messonnier, people like that, he basically took them off the air when in February they started saying, we're going to have a pandemic. This is not containable. He did not want that message out there. So then Dr. Fauci and Dr. Birx got involved, and they made this White House task force, which had the CDC director on it, but wasn't really driven by CDC. CDC was bound and gagged. So now you've got this major virologist that's running it. And I think his task was make COVID in his mind, I think the task was, and I haven't spoken to him about this or heard him talk about this, was my goal here is to make COVID as less of a problem as it can be. So I'm not going to look at anything else. I'm going to look at this at tunnel vision and say, what can I do? And then what he said is all biologically correct. I think there's not anything that you could really say. And we've talked about the mask thing where there was a change in the data that we got, but most of what he said has been correct from a scientific standpoint. And I think when you see him in testimony, he'll say, I'm not talking about individual rights or liberty here. I'm actually focused on COVID. So that's your job as the policymakers. And I think people don't understand that he's a subject matter expert. He's a person there advising on COVID policy, not on the whole country's policy. And maybe you might disagree with him on some of those policies, but it's up to the policymakers, the people that are elected, to actually take his advice and decide how to implement it. And I think that's the problem where people don't understand. He's not some infectious disease dictator. It's actually, President Trump was implementing certain things. Maybe your disagreement was with President Trump. President Trump wanted New York City locked down faster than it was. And I think people forget a lot of that. Yeah.
People don't remember that Trump was lambasting the mayor of New York for not locking down New York fast enough.
It's not that I agree with Dr. Fauci 100% on everything, but if I'm going to disagree with him, I'm going to think just like when you disagree with Leonard Peikoff, you're going to think through it a couple times to make sure that you actually do. And there may be certain individual issues that I might disagree with him on, but I have tremendous respect for him. And I would say that much of the good that happened in this pandemic, or much of the bad that didn't happen because of what Donald Trump would have done, is because Dr. Fauci was there. And for that reason, I'm forever grateful to him.
Yep. What is your view on the lab leak theory?
I think this is a possibility. And I think what happened with the lab leak theory, so this is another thing where people think that we kind of didn't think this is viable. And I've always thought it's a viable issue. It's just, again, another issue where Donald Trump happened to open his mouth and make things much harder, because what he did was jumble lab leak with biological weapon, with engineered virus. And those are kind of distinct possibilities. But anytime there's an infectious disease outbreak, you have to think, could this have come from a lab? Were people working with it? And we know that coronaviruses are important, and the research on coronavirus is very vital. And the Wuhan Institute of Virology was doing a lot of research with those coronaviruses, and they have had problems with biosafety. So this is something I think that we want to know the answer to. And I think that there is a possibility that it could come from there. I think there's an equal, if not more, possibility that it was a natural, but I think we want to know the answer. And the Chinese government has done nobody any favors here by their lack of transparency and by spouting off conspiracy theories that this came from a US military lab, or that this came from frozen food. So I do think this needs to be investigated. The Chinese government needs to be more transparent. They need to stop you can't trust what the scientists are saying because you don't know if they're speaking freely or not because of the Chinese government. They've basically blocked all investigation into the origin. They kind of obfuscated when the WHO team was there. And I think that this is something that we want to know. There's a lot of inconsistencies in the data, and I don't know if that's because of clerical errors or just mistakes, or if there's something else. But the fact is the Chinese government could fix this immediately just by being transparent. And that should be the global norm. So I think we need to investigate this fully. Dr. Fauci has said that himself as well. And I think that I don't think that this is a biological weapon. I don't think this was an engineered virus, but could there have been an accident? Yes, there could have been an accident, but I think we need to do a lot more investigation to know. And if it's not an accident, we need to know what animal it was between bats and humans, because we want to change our interaction with that animal so this doesn't happen again. So I think there are important questions to answer. And I think that this is another area where the Chinese government has to increase their transparency and needs to be held accountable for not following an international norm of how to conduct research.
And what's your views on just the doing gain of function? Not to say that this was a consequence of gain of function, but what's your view on doing gain of function research? Is it a legitimate thing to be doing, and under what circumstances?
This is a very controversial topic in my field. It splits us halfway down the middle. Even in our think tank, we've got people on both sides of it, including my director, who is very against gain of function research, but then other people are for it. I think that there is some value to be gained from gain of function, and specifically trying to understand the steps by which a virus gets adapted to humans, what mutations are necessary, because that can help us predict. But the thing is, gain of function research has to be done in the appropriate biosafety level with a lot of transparency, a lot of no fault reporting if there's something bad happening, so people don't have any incentives to cover these things up. It has to be done with the appropriate biosafety. I think it's important. We're going to face more infectious disease threats. We're going to face more coronaviruses, more flu viruses. So we want to know what are the steps necessary. So I tend to be favorable of most gain of function research so long as it's done safely. And I think that's I'm kind of in the middle on how gain of function research should be handled.
And safely probably means not in China, given that one of the criteria of safety is transparency.
Yeah, I think you want if you're working with these dangerous pathogens, you need to have your labs to be able to be open to anybody to look at. You need to have a system of where people can report things, where people can look and see exactly what's on the logs, the medical records of the people working there. So you don't want to have any kind of secrecy around this type of thing, because that's a recipe for something bad to happen, or suspicion of something bad to happen, even if it didn't.
Sure. So somebody's asking, could gain of function be done in a fully automated lab?
Well, eventually you'd still have to have some interaction with the organism or what you're dealing with, but you could do some of that in automated, not all of it. I'm not a laboratorian, so I can't speak directly to all of the instruments and things that you need to do. But yes, I think there's always been an effort to make these things occur more safely.
Okay, so this is from the UK. I'm under 30 and live in the UK. I'm still unsure about the mRNA vaccine and its long-term effects, so I am not vaccinated yet. What long-term risks are there which I need to know about?
There have been no long-term risks that have been shown so far. Most of the signals for long-term risks do occur within the first several months of vaccination, and there's been nothing untoward. And remember, mRNA vaccines, even though they're called new because these are the first time in human, they've been studied for decades in mammal models that are non-humans, and there's not been any signal there. So I don't think there's any real risk at this point of any kind of long-term effect with the mRNA vaccines. But again, you're in England, you can get the AstraZeneca vaccine, get yourself vaccinated. Even you've got more than one option. You don't have to have a Pfizer and Moderna. There's AstraZeneca, there's J&J. You can get other ones that are non-mRNA if you're really hesitant. But I don't think that there's any problem with long-term effects. And I've been vaccinated since before Christmas. Was my first dose. So it's been a lot, and I've had no long-term effects.
Yeah, I've had both of mine since March or April. So Germany is recommending additional mRNA dose for those who took the AstraZeneca, J&J. Do you agree with that recommendation?
So what they're doing are mix and match studies. They're trying to find a way to boost immunity more. And Germany has come, there's some data to think if you use two different vaccines with two different technologies, you might get a better response. I don't think it's completely necessary to do that. I think it's something that's important to study, and it might improve our vaccines in the future or be better for certain people with immunosuppressed populations. So the German government is first doing that for the super elderly, people above the age of 80, where they might not have responded so well. I don't think this is something that we should necessarily do routinely because there's not enough data to say this. Again, see, look, this is an ivermectin thing. There's not enough data for me to say to do that, even though there is some promising data out there. I'm trying to be consistent here. But so I think that I wouldn't recommend necessarily doing it. People had started to say that with the J&J vaccine. I don't think that there's data to do that because we're not seeing significant breakthroughs. If that's the only way you can get fully vaccinated or get a second dose, if somehow you're having a hard time finding the second AstraZeneca dose, it's completely fine to get that. I just don't think it should be necessarily done routinely yet without more data.
All right. So we got a few more vaccine questions. Is the first and second shot of the Pfizer vaccine identical? Or in other words, do you get the same shot twice?
You get the same shot twice.
I thought so. Let's see. If J&J is also based on spike protein, why were questions about its efficacy against the Delta variant?
So it is against the spike protein. There was efficacy questions because we didn't see the data. There was efficacy questions against Moderna and Pfizer, and they didn't have data yet. And when the data came out, it said it looks like it's good. The Johnson & Johnson vaccine is something where not very many people relatively have been vaccinated with it. So there was a question, could the Delta variant get around the J&J vaccine? And basically what we were waiting for was the data. And people, I think, misinterpret some of the efficacy data from the earlier trial with J&J, where they've got this 66% efficacy. And they try to make an apples to apples comparison to Moderna and Pfizer, which you cannot because the trials were done at different times with different levels of variants in different countries, different prevalence of the infection. So you're more likely when the Johnson & Johnson trial just to come into contact with COVID-19 than you were during the Moderna and Pfizer vaccine trials, which were done during the height of lockdowns. So who's to say that Moderna and Pfizer would still have that 95 if you would have done them at the same time. So I think the J&J vaccine is equivalent. I actually recommend that to people because it's a one and done. So I don't have to bug them to go back and get their second dose. Because it's come to that now, getting people vaccinated is you just have to get it, check the box. So that's why I think was the efficacy issues from the earlier trial that they misinterpreted, plus the fact that the data was a little bit slow going to come out, but it came out in the last 48 hours and I'm happy with it.
Okay, good. So there's a question here I don't understand. Maybe, so is there some study about 13 nurses who took Moderna? Yeah, I don't get this. Right. All right. I'm not sure what the question is. Let's see. What's the evidence of antibody resistance in people who've had COVID? I had it in November and I'm holding off on the vaccine.
So natural immunity does give you some protection. It's not nothing. And it does, and reinfections are relatively rare outside of certain variants, specifically the South African beta variant, where reinfection can occur. There is some immune evasion that goes on there. So what I tell people that have been vaccinated is, yes, you got some protection. We don't know how long.
That had the disease, not who were vaccinated.
Yeah, people who have had prior infection have some protection. It's going to last for some time. They're likely going to be protected from severe disease and hospitalization. There are some issues with variants that you might want to worry about, especially as the United States, 10% of our cases are the South African variant. So I tell people, based on the clinical data that we've seen, that I would get a single dose of a vaccine. That will boost you up high enough that I think it should be.
Okay.
And there's enough data there. And I think it's just hard for the guidance to change on this. I think that there's enough data that people who've had prior infection, that one dose is probably sufficient for them, but it's going to take some time for that to become official policy.
Do children need to wear masks indoors in public?
So if a child is vaccinated, no. If a child is not vaccinated, I think it depends on the risk tolerance of the parents. And this is what we've been very horrible at through this pandemic, is teaching people how to make risk calculations. Yep. Remember, children less likely to get severe disease, less likely to spread it. Obviously, if you've got an asthmatic child or a child that had a heart transplant or something, you need to be very careful with that child. And I would recommend wearing a mask. For other children, I would say it's up to your risk tolerance. Just be prepared that you might get a COVID exposure, you might get a COVID infection, but it's something where I think parents need to think about what the risk is and what the benefit of that activity is and make a judgment on it. I would be careful in especially congregated, crowded places where there's likely to be a lot of spread. If there's like 40 little kids running around, there's likely to be spread. You've got to think about that a little bit differently, but in general, it's going to come down to individual patient or parental risk tolerance.
Yeah, I mean, I wish from the beginning they had relied on individuals to make kind of risk assessments. But the other thing, I mean, maybe we've discovered is that we don't teach people to think very well about these kind of risks and about these kind of trade-offs. And people make really bad decisions when, but of course that's not, the solution is not central planning, even when that's the case. What's the danger right now in areas and states in the US that have large unvaccinated numbers of unvaccinated people?
So it depends on who's not vaccinated. So it's a simple biological fact that if you've got unvaccinated populations, COVID is there, it's going to increase cases. Whether or not it raises deaths and hospitalization depends on who your unvaccinated individuals are. In many places that have low vaccination numbers, the high risk people are vaccinated, meaning above the age of 65. So you won't necessarily see them run into problems. But clearly that's not the case in some places. So Springfield, Missouri, I mentioned it earlier, that looks like they're getting into some trouble in the hospitals, and they have very low vaccination rates there. So clearly their high risk people haven't been vaccinated. So it depends on who's not vaccinated. I think what's going to happen is COVID is going to become a regional problem. There's going to be some parts of the country where it's still a major issue and other parts where it's been left behind. We're going to see this divide. And unfortunately, it's probably going to fall on political lines between red and blue states is what we're likely going to see, where COVID is more of a risk and less of a risk. So states like Arkansas, Mississippi, Alabama, Missouri, that's where we're seeing clusters, Nevada as well. But states like New York, Pennsylvania, it's not really something that we even think about on the same way we did.
Right, I think this is the last question. I'm on Kaiser in California, so I have a network doctor. How do I determine the best doctor to get in or out of network if I get a condition? I guess this is a broader question.
So you have to look. So I would first, I think having your PCP doesn't necessarily have to be the world's expert in everything. What your PCP has to be is somebody that works with you that can help you navigate that decision depending upon what condition you have. So your first stop should be your primary care doctor because they're going to know other doctors. They're going to know what the capabilities are of the Kaiser system or the network outside that system. That's one thing to do. If you've got something rare, I do think you can look up who's writing about this, who's talking about this. Are there centers of excellence? Many universities will say, we're a center of excellence of this disease. Those are things to think about if you've got a certain condition. But I think your PCP should be your first help. You need a doctor or somebody with medical knowledge to help guide you through this so that you don't make the wrong decisions and you don't miss something that might be right in your backyard because you're looking at Mass General or something.
I think the challenge with, I don't know if you're familiar with Kaiser in California. It's like a big HMO. And so the number of doctors is very, very limited in terms of the coverage. And they tend not to send people out of network. I guess maybe unless it's an unusual disease where there's nobody in network that can help them. So it's a little bit more tricky because your selection is very limited.
Yeah, so I would just look and see what the condition is and then spend some time on the internet trying to figure out who the leaders are in that field, which universities, which hospitals have, like I said, centers of excellence, and then think about trying to get aligned with them if possible.
Yeah, and if you have the option, invest in finding a good primary care physician because they're going to be key to navigating if you ever get sick. All right, good. Thank you. Hey, Amesh, I really appreciate this. This has been great. A ton of information in almost an hour and a half. So thank you. Thank you guys for being here. Thanks to all the super chatters with $30 off Alejandrina's target of $400 a show. So, maybe somebody will step in, Alejandrina, in the next couple of minutes to get us there. And for the rest of you guys, don't forget to like the show if you like it, of course, before you leave. And don't forget to show your support. You can go and do that on YBS.com/support, Patreon, Subscribestar, or any of these other places. So thanks again. Thanks you, Amesh. Really appreciate that. I think that was great. Jeff asked, we just opened in Alberta, no masks. It's a myth that unvaccinated are now more at risk. I'm not sure why that's a risk, why that's a myth. If you're not vaccinated, you're almost by definition, more at risk. Doesn't mean the risk is high. It just means you're more at risk than somebody who's vaccinated who is not going to get it. right? But cool. I'm glad to see places are eliminating the mask requirements. I think in Puerto Rico we go mask free starting Monday. All right, everybody. Thank you. I really appreciate it. I see you guys have stepped up. Thank you, Charlie. Thank you, Brian. Thank you, Joe. Thanks, guys, for getting us over the $400. Thanks for everybody who showed support during the show. I know I missed some of you who just gave money, who didn't ask questions. I think I got all the questions. There are a couple of questions that were not really for Amesh, so I've kept them on, and I'll address them tomorrow. Tomorrow, we'll be doing a show on the 4th of July. Not sure exactly what time. I'll post it either later tonight or first thing in the morning. And then on Tuesday, we've got a show on parenting with Gina Gorlin and Rebecca Gurn, which should be a terrific show. So join us for that. That'll be at 8 p.m. East Coast time. All right, everybody. Have a great 4th of July. And I look forward to talking to you tomorrow. Bye.